One of the greatest mechanisms ever invented by humanity for thriving and survival is science. So in a period of high uncertainty and challenge, it makes sense to perhaps check in with a scientist here and there. And perhaps the best scientist to check in with in the world is our good friend, David Krakauer. Hi, David. How are you?
I'm well. Nice to be with you, Rob.
Great. So how are things at the Santa Fe Institute?
Well, things are difficult in the sense they're difficult for everybody, that people are working remotely and so forth. On the other hand, we've reached a point where complexity has become so obvious in the world and new ideas about complex systems are required. So in that sense, we're busier than ever because we've been very involved in the crisis and all of its sequelae.
So recently you wrote an article with Jeffrey West that appeared in Nautilus. And in this article, you argued that this is the first complexity crisis in history. What do you mean by that?
Yeah, I think we were pointing out essentially that we have now reached a point where all the critical systems of the world have come into alignment. It's like an extraordinary astronomical event. That, as I said earlier, dietary preference, the density of social gatherings, the ubiquity of cheap transport, the density of cities, etc., have aligned so many networks, so many different networks, economic, ecological, social, that a perturbation that normally might have been contained within any one of them. So think about an economic crisis, it's typically the markets, right? And there are obviously consequences on life. But here, all of these networks are aligned. So they all came down together. And we're calling that a complexity crisis. And we think it's new by virtue of urbanization, population density, technological connection, etc. So I think that whereas before you could fix a problem by fixing one of the systems, our sense now is that's no longer adequate, that now we need to have a systemic intervention. And that's something that society is not yet prepared for.
How do we have to think differently about these interconnected systems?
So these things are popping up all the time. So what's happened? Right, what's happened in part is human beings encroaching on areas of huge biodiversity. There are an estimated 2 million viruses that we've never yet encountered. Let's say a quarter of them have a mammalian intermediate host, which means that phylogenetically it's possible for them to jump to us.
Right.
Okay. What's changing is the rate of encounter of the human population with the non-human food sources. And it's coupled to things like deforestation, exactly agriculture, as you mentioned. So we're encroaching into the territories which are precisely the hotbeds of biodiversity from which we expect to be exposed to viruses. That level of contact is somewhat unprecedented in human history, meaning it's decades old, not centuries old.
In the article, you also talk about evolvability versus robustness. And I'd like you to explain that briefly, because for all of our business and organizational leaders with us today, they experience this in an analogous way in their businesses. So becoming great at what you do right now also opens you up to the threat of being disrupted in the future. Being evolvable means having a portfolio of options, but those options come at a cost. So talk about this notion from a complex system perspective of evolvability versus robustness.
Yeah, it's one of the most profound dualities in all complex systems. So let's define them. So robustness is the ability of a system to withstand a non-trivial perturbation. So you remove something essential and yet it continues to function. Evolvability is the ability of a system to discover new solutions to problems. Okay? So it goes beyond adaptation. It's actually innovative evolvability. And all systems experience the trade-off, right? So that if you build a system that's impervious to change in the environment, well, then how is it going to respond adaptively and evolve to the change in the environment? Now, life has discovered a whole series, a suite of mechanisms which allow you to balance the trade-offs, the most brutal of which is extinction and death. Most species on Earth, 99% of them, have gone extinct. And so evolvability has been achieved through essentially the survival of whatever particular function is working at that time, and everything else disappears. But that's not how our bodies work. And the way our bodies work is by investing a huge amount of energy into redundancy of various kinds. So bodies pay the energetic cost of robustness. And I think that's the thing that companies perhaps haven't understood. The market works according to the Darwinian principle. But maybe companies don't want to. And I think that will require a shift in emphasis, that if you're investing in the long term, you have to pay the cost of redundancy. There's no way out. And then how you achieve evolvability is maybe a more technical discussion. We can talk about it if you like. But I think it's very important to understand that without the redundancy, there is no robustness.
David, what are one or two insights from those essays that strike you?
Cities work. That's, I think, surprises a lot of people. We referred to it earlier, but this incredible empirical fact that the scaling of economic productivity, creativity in cities, as measured by things like filing patents and so on, the scaling exponent is identical to the scaling exponent for transmissible disease and violent crime. And it's a 15% compounding effect in both cases. So if you increase the size of a city, you get this benefit of scale for productivity and creativity, but you absolutely have to pay the cost in terms of increased disease transmission. And that is an extraordinary discovery, an empirical discovery. And the question that we're all trying to deal with is, can we decouple those two?
So can we have the benefits without the costs, or how can we mitigate the costs? What are we finding in that respect?
Well, there are places that deviate in one way or another from that empirical law. And I don't think we yet know why. The underlying theory has to do with the connectivity of the urban graph, if you like, the density, the division of labor. And I think what we're doing now, actually, Rob, where we somehow decouple the physical interaction from the informatic interaction, is going to be the answer to this problem. I mean, we all know that.
Interesting. So to oversimplify, by physical versus informatic, do you mean like what we're doing right now? We're having an interaction via data in a virtual space, but we have no physical connection. So therefore, the information can transmit rapidly, but the pathogen cannot.
Exactly. And we know how to decouple them. The big unanswered question, of course, for all of us is, to what extent is creativity coupled to physicality?
To what extent is physicality essential for amplifying our creative capabilities?
Yeah, I mean, I think that this is what we're all debating without a great deal of insight into it. It would seem on the one hand that you and I could quite easily write a paper or come up with a new idea without ever meeting. Why not? And, plenty of game players will form teams online that are extraordinarily effective, and they've never met each other. So we know it's possible. But there's something that seems to be required that's social, that we're not yet grasping. And maybe we can learn from the games environment.
Is it possible that the hypothesis that there might be something essential about physicality is more based on a bias of our billions of years of evolution, that we have evolved within that physical soup, and therefore we have a bias in favor of it as opposed to a clear-headed, objective observation of where we might be going.
It's possible. There's a whole area called the evolution of cooperation. So think about things like tit for tat and the prisoner's dilemma and so forth.
Yeah, game theory.
Game theory that studies, that studies these cooperative solutions in non-cooperative games, sometimes called Nash equilibria.
Yeah.
And what one learns mathematically in those games is an absolute key to finding cooperative, coordinated equilibria is repeated interaction. If you play one-shot games, you always get the negative, rather dire outcomes, right? Selfishness prevails. And I think one of the things that physicality did for free, by virtue of our limited mobility, is it ensured that we'd meet again, right? So Rob, if I'm your neighbor,
yeah,
and I steal your car, right? I'm there the next day for you to find me.
Yeah. Well, also, I think, David, there's a concept called propinquity, which makes great sense, which is the people around us, near us, are much more likely to be our friends or enemies because we have regular interactions with them.
But that's an interesting insight, Rob, because if this is true, that it's not physicality per se, but what in our world we call assortativity, what you're calling propinquity, maybe we can generate that by some other means to ensure we arrive at these cooperative equilibria. Again, not really been explored, but it's very interesting.
One of the aspects of your work, and we've talked about this a number of times, that intrigues me is you say everybody spends time looking at performance or intelligence. You want to study stupidity. How does it work? Where does it come? How does it work? Where does it come from? How does something like stupidity end up in a result of an evolutionary survival-based system?
Yeah, so again, from my point of view, operationally, intelligence is making hard problems easy, and stupidity is making easy problems hard. So that's
stupidity is making easy problems hard.
Exactly.
Great.
And so I think the deep answer to this question is the evolution of rule systems that misalign with their time and context. And that's how evolution works, right? You acquire algorithms in some sense. They could be genetic, the way that genes are regulated, turned on and off, or the way we think through problems. And culture is this incredible mechanism that transmits these, by and large, historically adaptive rule systems forward in time. But the world changes, and those rules in that new context make relatively easy problems harder. And that's, I think, the ultimate origin. I study evolution. So I study things that are over 3 billion years old in terms of life on Earth. And so life's been around for quite a while. Planet's about 4.5 billion years old. The Homo lineage is about 3 million. Modern humans are about 300,000. Agriculture is about 10,000. Science, parliamentary democracy, 300. America, 200, right? So we're dealing with relatively new phenomena in the history of the planet. And they were created in a certain context to deal with a certain problem. Certainly the US Constitution, which is something that I've studied, was created to deal with problems of despotic monarchs. That's part of the big deal. And now you could make an argument that hasn't gone away.
And we're on our way back, trending back toward that.
We could be trending back towards that, and the Constitution might become more important than it was then, perhaps.
Absolutely.
But there might be periods where it wasn't so useful. And so I think reckoning with rule systems that are no longer adaptively appropriate, that's what the study of stupidity is about.
And it sounds like part of this is human beings or any kind of agent, any kind of actors within these rule systems having an inability or at least a difficulty of standing back from the rule systems, reflecting on the context and seeing if the rule systems are still fit for purpose. because we continue on our path dependent where we've been doing this forever. We've been shaking hands. We've been, hugging when we see each other. Well, in a pandemic environment, that probably isn't the best thing to do.
Yeah, it gets to your earlier question about robustness and evolvability, which is what culture does well is transmit rule systems. Wisdom, real ideas that worked, that we're acquiring for free, that we're the beneficiaries of. So it's very important to understand that. So take science, for example. Science benefits from the accumulated understanding of the natural and cultural world. On the other hand, that inertia that's built into the system that's so important has what has led to the resistance to new theories, right? So famously plate tectonics, obviously even more famously, the geocentric theory of our solar system.
Right. Yeah.
So there are good reasons to resist change because good ideas shouldn't be subject to tiny fluctuations in opinion. So how do we do that? And I think what stupidity is the name we give to the instantaneous misalignment of requirement and rule. And the question is, how do we fix it?
David, looking forward, how is Santa Fe Institute preparing for beyond the pandemic?
I think there's sort of two questions there. One is about our role in the culture as a producer of ideas and solutions. And the other is the internal structure of the Institute in terms of its viability, right? So for us, the most important thing is to be responsive to the crisis and generate the best science we can, right? And make sure that the science is true to the need. As I mentioned to you earlier, one of the very surprising consequences of this pandemic has been a significant increase in SFI's engagement with the world, both in terms of the adoption of its science, but our community. We have more participation now than we've ever had. By almost 3 to 4 times.
So David, you mean people from anywhere in the world who are logging in for your webinars, for your lectures, for your roundtables, which you have on a regular basis at Santa Fe Institute, but for the most part, they were in person before.
It's much, for example, we'd have a meeting on what might seem like a rather esoteric topic. We have these meetings, every week. And we'd see the same people, plus or minus a few, member of our external faculty. But now we have parliamentarians. We have, directors of major banks. We have social activists. There's been it's not just the numbers, it's the diversity of people looking to complexity and presumably other forms of science and insight to help them with their particular causes. One thing that surprised me is maybe shouldn't be surprising, is that the groups that adopt some of these new methodologies aren't necessarily the most powerful. And they're more flexible. They're more willing to adopt new methods because it's more important to in some sense, catalyze change. So that's obvious in hindsight, but it was a very nice thing to discover in practice during this period.
So David, coming down to the end, but in 20 years, there's a tweet storm about David Krakauer. You're happy about it. What is the tweet storm?
It's that David and Rob finally, after 20 years of being holed up in their homes, could meet again. That's interesting.
I find it hard to believe that many people would really care about that.
You and
me.
Yeah, as we would care. We care. I want to hear you sing again. I think God, that's a good question. Because as you know, I'm on no social media at all. And so it's not a world I live in. I think in the end, I don't know the answer, but it would be very nice to think that some major transition in the way society works came from the kind of science that we do, and that it was constructive. Science for good. I think we have been perhaps naive historically in thinking that science and policy and politics and society are not complexly entangled, but they are. And I think as we go into a more and more complex world, our kind of science becomes more and more critical, which means we have to be much more careful So whereas it was atomic energy in the 40s and 50s, it might be complexity science in the next several decades. So I'd like that tweet not to be, there was a, radioactive complexity meltdown, but actually that some new insight helped in some significant way.
Well, great. David, this has been fantastic as always, and I do look forward to our next opportunity to be together in person. An extraordinary astronomical event has recently occurred. The first complexity crisis in human history hits our entire planet. Evolvability versus robustness. We all need to manage those trade-offs. How can we have both at the same time? How can we amplify as well the things that we love and de-emphasize the things we don't? Are the rule systems we have misaligned with our evolving context? As the world changes, do we change appropriately? As the great 20th century epistemologist and political philosopher Karl Popper articulated, by criticizing our theories, we let our theories die in our stead. With organizations like the Santa Fe Institute and scientists like David Krakauer leading the way, we all have a hope of having a better future. David, thank you again for your time and your insights.
Thank you very much. Live long and prosper.
Great. Nanu, nanu.
Nanu, nanu.